Right. So on this episode, we are joined by a special friend, Andri Feldmann, a Canadian Swiss. Where were you? Were you born in Canada or were you born here?
I was born in Switzerland. My parents moved to Canada when I was just checking out the stuff because I was filling out Jack's. I just had a son. Jack's birth certificate. You have to get his Canadian citizenship, so I had to look at all my documents. And so we moved to Canada in 1990, and I was born in 1985. So I was like 4.5 years old, and then I was a naturalized citizen.
Nice. So we met the summer of, what was that now? That must have been, what was it? 2017? Could it be?
Oh man, it's got to be further back than that.
26? Yeah, it must be.
It's got like 20. I would have said like 2015.
2015.
Because it was after the Moxy launch was in 2013, so it was after that. So 2014, 2015, something like that.
Right. And then, so we met because one of our skiers, we won't mention her name, but she was working with you doing some diagnostic work because you had come up, you were using different endurance tests and different sort of, technological interventions with some of the pro athletes. So we got invited to meet. We met randomly. Then you even chucked me on the bike and made me do some of the testing too, from what I remember.
Yeah,
and
I think that the athlete was injured, like couldn't, or something was there, and you ended up doing a bunch of testing. Yeah,
that's right. And then we ended up forming a good friendship and also a professional relationship. And then we started utilizing the different things that you were involved with, such as Spiro Tiger, which is a respiratory training device. The Moxi Monitor, which was a near infrared measurement device that goes on a local muscle that measures saturation of muscle oxygen and also blood flow, which we then ended up training the Zurich Lions with, as well as doing different tests that were quite pioneering here in Swiss. I always mention your name with Moxy. Can we go straight into what is Moxy? What does it do? Why did we end up using it for the testing? And what was the unique data that it showed?
Yeah, that's a lot. Oh yeah, I just had to say, I think when we first met, you didn't have a beard. Am I allowed to say that on the show live?
I think I had a blonde. I think I had a blonde mohawk, didn't I? Was that back then?
Was that already? I'm not sure if. Yeah. Anyways, but just a ways back. So Moxy, yeah. So I'm a co-developer of the Moxy. The Moxy is a near infrared spectroscopy device, like you said, and it measures muscle oxygen saturation. And I use it for diagnostics. So generally, when I talk about the diagnostics, we always talk more about endurance-based diagnostics, and you compare it to things like blood lactate testing or ergospirometry, like VO2 gas exchange testing, which I also did. So I did lots and lots of lactate testing for a pretty long time, like starting really young. I think I started doing my first lactate test when I was like 14 because my dad did it as well.
Didn't you do lactate testing when you climbed Kilimanjaro too? You crazy dude.
Yeah, I did a bunch of sampling like on myself.
Right.
Yeah. So that's where you get like this like lactate paradox where you get high altitudes and your oxygen saturation, like arterial saturation, drops because of the altitude and the drop of partial pressure. And so you have less oxygen available, but you don't build lactate spontaneously. And so the whole aerobic anaerobic thing. But let's not. We can talk about that after we got some time. But so anyway, so the Moxy Monitor is this muscle oxygen saturation measurement device. And simply said, it's this little device. It's about this big, if the proportions say, and you put it onto a muscle, and it measures the change of your muscle oxygen values, and it does this in real time. And these values are highly dynamic, and they relate to how you supply oxygen to the muscle and how your muscle is using oxygen to create energy. And so it's a pretty cool device because you get this like real-time local feedback of what's happening bioenergetically in the muscle. And you can then perform diagnostics on this, very similar if you want to lactate testing or gas exchange testing. You can use like ramp test protocols and you look at, well, what's happening with my with my muscle oxygen. And then what we then end up doing is, because of this real-time feedback that happens very, very, very quickly, is we started then applying it to, let's say, non-endurance-based sports, so kind of more tempo sports, so like ice hockey, which we then did in Canada. If you do it in Canada, you got to do things with hockey. And so you get these really cool images that you don't get with blood lactate, because blood lactate is always, it's a postponed measurement, because you measure it in the blood, lactate is produced in the muscle. So you have this big time delay. And so you get this like kind of real-time feedback. You really see how oxygen's used, and you take a break and you see it recover again. And which is an interesting analysis then on how to do endurance training steady state, but also how to do kind of interval type training, which is what we did with the Lions.
Right. And due to sort of the way that the muscle utilizes its oxygen, you sort of separated guys' results, right? So you had some guys that had a utilization problem, and then some guys that had more of a supply problem. Is that correct?
Yeah. So generally speaking here, if we take it back, is that you have this famous performance parameter, VO2. So oxygen consumption in the system. So you have systemic VO2. And generally that's then measured through gas exchange at the mouse with this mask. And this is often kind of the gold standard measurement for what would classically be called aerobic performance. Basically how much oxygen you consume, and it correlates highly to performance. So you get really high values in these like crazy endurance athletes, with the highest ones generally being some crazy Norwegian cross-country skiers with like 90 VO2 max. And so this high correlation between performance and VO2 max. Now, the issue with, I'm losing track of myself here a little bit.
The issue with VO2 max in relation to performance sports.
Yeah, no, but the question you asked before I went off, oh yeah, with lactate, VO2 max, lactate,
and supply and utilization.
Right, there you go. The supply and utilization. So, and VO2 max is itself a product of oxygen supply and oxygen demand. So if you measure VO2, it's really, there's a few formulas that dictate VO2, and one of them is it's cardiac output. So how much blood can your heart pump, and how much multiplied, so the product of how much oxygen is taken off of the blood. So the arteriovenous difference. And this is your VO2. Now there's a few other formulas that dictate what actually happens in the muscle, but this is one of the general ones, called the Fick equation. And now, if the big discussion around VO2 max that often happens and is disputed is if I have VO2, and what's limiting my VO2? So if I have a VO2 of 60, why isn't it 65 or 70? Because I want it to go up, because higher is correlated with better performance. And if you know that it's a product of oxygen supply and demand, you can then argue, well, maybe I'm being limited by either this oxygen supply component or this oxygen demand component. And those are obviously different things. An oxygen supply component is an argument more for this cardiac output side. So is my heart strong enough to move blood enough, right? Or is my respiratory system strong enough to load the blood that I'm moving with oxygen? Or you can argue it from this demand side or oxygen utilization side, where is my muscle even able to use the oxygen that my blood, my heart is pumping through to it? And this is where NIRS is interesting, because what NIRS does, so what the Moxy does is at a local level, it measures this change in oxygen. And so a decreasing value means at the moment of measurement, the balance between oxygen supply and oxygen demand is negative. So you are actually using more oxygen than you're supplying. That's why my oxygen saturation is decreasing. If it's the other way around, if the value is going up, well, I'm supplying more oxygen than my muscle actually needs. And if I have this flat here to steady state, it's balanced itself out. So Now, if you look at the NIRS technology and you tell yourself, well, NIRS tells us something about oxygen supply and demand locally, and we're trying to figure out how do I improve my VO2 max, which is a question of oxygen supply and demand systemically, we then thought, well, can't I use this local measurement to identify if I'm actually using enough oxygen locally? And if I'm using the oxygen locally really well, then it's likely more of a systemic problem. So it's this supply problem. Okay, I hope everyone's following that. And so what we started doing with testing is you would try to test and figure out, well, can the athlete in the sport that they actually want to do? So in hockey, we did it on the ice. A cyclist, we would do it on a cycling ergometer. And we would see at high intensities if they're really utilizing their oxygen in the working muscle well. And if they were, so they were showing really low oxygen values, we would then argue, well, a training plan needs to now be established to increase the supply of oxygen. Because if you do use a training plan that tries to further increase the utilization of oxygen, you're just going to keep making the problem worse, because you already don't have any oxygen. So how are you can't utilize more and more and more of something that you don't have. And so the idea was to optimize this bioenergetic training by creating two simple groups. Again, it's oversimplified, but that's often the way it is if you want to make something practical. And that's what we did with the Lions, right? We did this testing and looked at, hey, who's really able to use oxygen and who isn't. And then we made these two training groups, right? The kind of the supply limited and the demand limited, and tried to adjust training to those diagnostic results. I think. Sorry about my train of thought there. I went off.
No, it was good. I mean, Mike, you got it all right.
100% spot on. And I had my mic off, but I was filling in some of the words as you were saying them. So it made perfect sense. Now, if you're talking specifically, you're looking at a local insertion of a device to measure the local function to try to get a systemic measurement. That's how how did you go about? That's the one thing I don't understand is how could you differentiate between it? Would you do blood lactate coupled with it? How would it go about?
Yeah, so just about the device, it's a surface device, right? So it's all non-invasive, just so people are clear. And yeah, so this is an issue, right? Because the device only measures the muscle that you put it on. So if you put it on vastus lateralis, that's where it's measuring. But we're making inferences to the entire system, which you have to be careful about. Now, so generally speaking, at the very beginning, we did lots of comparisons with these systemic measures. So with blood lactate or with VO2 data. And so there's good correlations between, for example, blood lactate accumulation, so these classical curves, and changes in this muscle oxygen value. There's also good correlations between your ventilatory thresholds from your ergospirometry gas exchange and these values, even though the blood oxygenation values are on one single muscle. Now, there are issues with that. So if I put my Moxy device or my NIRS device on my bicep, okay, and I do bicep curls, the value is going to drop in my bicep very rapidly. But my system is not going to feel any of that, right? So you need to be careful. But if you do whole body exercises, there's a general whole body response that's reflected in actually every muscle. And this is interesting. So if you take novices and you take elite athletes, so for example, runners, if you take elite, like top marathon runners, and you put NIRS devices on their legs and on their forearms. So forearms, you'd think that's nothing to do with running. You get the same like dynamics in the forearm as in the legs. You could do threshold testing on the forearm of these elite runners. You'd get the same response because there's this global response. Whereas the amateur runners, they don't have that. You have to test on the muscle that's actually doing work. And this gets back to a little bit this supply and demand limited. So if your problem is I can't get enough oxygen into the system, then the whole system has a oxygen supply problem because the whole system is taxed. Whereas if you're actually getting enough oxygen in, then you can only measure any change in the muscle that's working, and the other ones have get tons of oxygen anyways. Does that help you a little bit?
Absolutely. So when you're doing this, have you noticed a difference between limb to limb? So like right leg to left leg?
So funnily enough, that's what my master's degree was based on. And we use the data from the ice hockey players for this. And yes, there is.
And was that a predictor of injury?
I can't tell you conclusively because the data wasn't run. But we saw differences basically in every single player.
Yeah, so maybe I'll give you, so I don't do any rehab stuff. So I still feel like I'm only with healthy athletes.
So but, we just talk shit. We just talk shit and pontificate.
No, which I think is great. And I think the question's totally valid. I'm trying to set up a big rehab project here with Mocklingen actually. Because I think people ask me this all the time and I'm always give the argument like, I don't know. I mean, maybe. But maybe on that a couple points. So right and left differences happen, including in cycling. And I'm going to use an example. So if you had pro cyclist and had a lot of right leg pain, big right left leg Moxy differences. And they're like, hey, something's going on here. Brought him in, got him checked out. And what he had was a narrowing of the iliac artery. He wasn't getting blood flow in, okay? Then they do stenosis, they open that up, right, left leg, same again. So there's some pretty, like, I mean, this is an extreme one because the recovery was so quick. It was really just like this thing was tightened and you open that up and now you're good again. But yeah, so you can, this is again, the problem with this is the advantage and the problem with the technology. You get to measure right left differences, which is interesting, but you have to make sure that if you're just measuring one leg and you want to make a systemic argument, that you know it's the systemic argument.
Yes.
So you need to spend maybe a little bit more time. You know, like you should do this always, anyways. I mean, anybody who takes a diagnostic tool and like applies it once and makes any kind of training recommendations, I'm like, yeah, that's probably dumb. So if you're gonna have a Moxy, you should probably use it over and over. Don't just do one test. I mean, it's easy to use, like data track that a bit and really see, is this my athlete? And then you can use it. But right-left differences do exist in cycling as well, even though not as often, because I mean, it's a pretty symmetrical thing. There actually hamstring quad is more interesting. But hockey players, we've definitely had people, big right-left leg differences where we talked like a skate coach and they'd be like, yeah, they got some funky push-off thing going as well. What's interesting then too is if people have like right left leg differences skating, but not like squatting or something. But you get people with right left leg different squatting. We had one of the step players, I'm assuming we're not saying any names, who had a knee injury, I believe, knee or hip, and there was a big right left leg different squatting as well. I don't know if you remember, Alex.
Yeah.
So there's this idea of injury and right left differences. I think there might be something there without saying there's something there.
Well, one of the things that I saw from what I can remember was there was significant differences. However, there wasn't that much significance in how the legs responded to the demand of what was going on. So there was the same trends. They just had different starting values, and there might be the rate of utilization of oxygen might be slightly different, but to say it was something big and significant, it didn't come through. So
did you ever hook this up with the 1080 and utilize this simultaneously with the 1080, Brooker?
But to do what? To
measure force output with systemic or local fatigue. And was there a correlation between the lactic lactic levels on the one leg, and because you're going to see when you're with the 1080, you'll see horizontal force production, and you'll be able to see the difference between legs. So was there a difference between force output between legs?
Yes, there's always change. There's always differences. They wasn't partnered all together.
Associated with it is what I mean.
Right. So we never chucked the Moxies on to all the guys when we were doing our testing with that. We kept it all separate. I guess the year, if we would have continued working, it would have all kept going. That would have probably been the next step, was combining the two together. But one of the things that and I remember your dad talking about this, Andri, and Andri's dad, he's the definition of a mad scientist. Like Cal Dietz is a mad scientist, but Andri's dad is a mad scientist. He introduced himself as a goat farmer to me the first time, and ended up being one of the most well-read physiologists. He was always talking about horse physiology and saying how that was relating to humans. And he would mention that he was training a hockey player that had a lower limb injury, and he was improving the cardiovascular properties of the player by just doing like delt raises and upper body work. And I was like, there's no way that's improving his gas tank on his legs. Like, there's no way. And then he would explain why. And this, and one of the other things that he mentioned too, which comes to my mind with that same skier that we was talking about, when you guys measured her doing a ski run, the beauty of the Moxy 2 found, because it looks at blood flow and not just oxygen, is she was going through complete full body occlusion, right, during the ski race. And no one would have thought that, right? Yeah. That's not been measured before. But the fact that you can put it on someone when they're doing sport, when they're playing a game, when they're doing a competition, you can get such good data that otherwise it's all, it's theoretical based in a lab.
The Moxy's crazy. The one for sure. One of the things is that also, and so my dad. The reason I do all this is because of my dad. So he's crazy for sure. Crazy like a fox. But I always have to pull people back with the Moxy as well, because people do a lot of crazy stuff with it. Where I'm always like, I don't know about this. And I'm gung ho for it. I think it's a fantastic tool. So I definitely think, maybe back to the right left thing. So, because I do think that's really interesting. And so I've done a bunch of research with elite climbers, and we do forearm measurements. And so climbing is a great application for NIRS, because all these classical measures, so gas exchange, VO2, blood lactate, those are all nonsensical for sport climbers. It doesn't correlate with any kind of performance, because it's really predicated a lot on this like really forearm local fatigue. And so now with NIRS, you get to do this measurement on this forearm. You really get to kind of zoom in on these problems, and you get this big dominant, non-dominant arm difference. And what you also see is you see then the fatiguing rates that the right and the left hand don't necessarily fatigue the same, with the non-dominant hand fatiguing quicker than the dominant hand. But you see this kind of in live terms of physiology. And what's interesting for a strength conditioning coach, I think that this is probably common knowledge, or people, at least it's prophesized, I guess, is common knowledge. So is you really get with the NIRS data, you see the effect of this high intensity HIIT training and over longer periods of time. So not just during the training, but you see a response in the signal that's happening after training, 24 hours after that, 48 hours after that, that you can still follow. So you see the changed physiology, and you see it hasn't actually recovered yet, because the dynamics of your oxygen utilization and your oxygen supply is still different likely from that specific training. And you see right and left hand differences for that.
So how is this device, and you could just say no comment if it's like, patent protected sort of thing, but how are you going about actually measuring things locally over the skin?
Yeah, so this isn't patent protected. There's a patent, but you can go look at it. So it's nice and complicated. So we're not too worried about it. Yeah, so let's just do the basics. So it's near infrared spectroscopy. That's the technology. For any viewers who are like, I don't know what that is, everyone knows what that is. If you've been in a hospital and you put on a pulse oximeter, those little clip things in your fingers, especially with COVID, those are super popular right now. Or you watch Grey's Anatomy, all of those little things on their fingers. That is also near infrared spectroscopy. Okay, and what it does is it sends infrared light into your tissue. And if you're a kid and you put a flashlight on your hand, you know that light can propagate through tissue because your hand glows, right? So the light can go through tissue. And infrared lights specifically can penetrate very deep. And in the infrared spectrum, you can differentiate between oxygenated hemoglobin, so oxygenated red blood cells, and deoxygenated hemoglobin, deoxygenated red blood cells. Because they absorb this infrared light at a different wavelength. So you can basically, the easiest is it's in this light, those two molecules look like they have different colors. And so you can count them and separate them. And then all of a sudden you can generate this value for oxygenation. Now, the difference between a pulse oximeter, which goes on your finger, is the pulse oximeter specifically only looks at the pulsation part, and everything else gets ignored. And so the pulsation part in your finger is always arterial blood coming from your heart. That's what the pulse is. And that's why you get arterial oxygen saturation. The problem with arterial oxygen saturation is it's not very dynamic. It's always 100% or 97% or 98%. That's why you control it in the hospital. It should always be really high. What happens with people with COVID, their blood oxygen drops down. That's why they're always monitoring it. So their arterials drops down. That value should always be high. But because it's always 100% or close to that, it's not very interesting for athletics because you're measuring this performance profile and it's just 99% the whole time. So, I mean, it's not going to give you any information. And once it drops below 95 or 94%, during exercise, you already give it a special name. It's called exercise-induced arterial hypoxemia. So it's not supposed to change. What NIRS, muscle NIRS devices do is that it doesn't take the pulsating part. You put it on a muscle and you send it in. And it only localizes in on the little blood vessels, on the capillaries. And the capillaries are in the muscle. So it only looks at the blood vessels that are basically in this oxygen exchange area. So you get this highly dynamic value for oxygenation in the muscle. How's that?
So that's awesome. I understand it. So when I use pulse oximeters, they're inconsistent as hell. They're almost unreliable in some instances. I've had 5 different pulse oximeters on the same finger, switch, 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 and they all say something different. Maybe 2 will agree with each other, right? They're as far as I'm concerned, they're pieces of shit.
But how much difference are you getting in those?
I've used a, oh my gosh, I forget what the name of it is. It's an oxygen deprivation bag, the Live O2 or Live O2 or whatever it's called, right?
It's the Epoch stuff, Andri.
Yeah. So I assumed it would be something like that. I haven't heard of the brand, I guess, but.
So that's one of the companies that I've used. I had my guy, Kevin Love, buy it. It's like, I don't know, like 10 grand or something like that. Yeah. And so we did oxygen deprivation followed by saturation, right? So he went, and so monitoring it is the biggest pain in the ass because we've had it on. Now they've told me that if you have it on opposite hands, like if you have one on one hand, one on the other hand, it can have asymmetrical results. I've had asymmetrical results on fingers within the same hand. And then I've even switched within and still haven't had consistent results with some of these. So from a reliability standpoint or a consistency standpoint, how consistent have you had it tested? How do you like kind of wheel and deal throughout all that stuff to make sure like that it's like a quality thing? Because that would drive me nuts.
So about the arterial, so the pulse oximeters, that I had some crap pulse oximeters because I mean you can buy them real cheap. But I do feel if you get a good quality one that it's pretty consistent, and over all fingers and right and left hand you should get plus minus a percent the same value. If you're not, that's weird. I mean, arterial oxygen saturation doesn't vary. Like this should not be a problem. So I don't know what's going on. That's funky. I mean, yeah, that's terrible. I mean, if you can't trust your measurement tool, whatever it is, and it makes the athletes insecure, it makes you insecure. The athlete gets insecure because you're insecure. It's just, you know, the death spiral. Okay, now so about NIRS. So I use one specific NIRS device that I'm the co-developer of, Moxy. Obviously, I think that's a great device, but there's lots of other devices out there. And this is a general problem for the technology is there's no gold standard. There's not like this one NIRS device where they say, this is the right one. Everyone has to measure like this. That doesn't exist. And the essential problem with the technology is that you can't do blood draws of muscle capillaries, right? I can't do an experiment and say, okay, my NIRS device says 70%. I'm going to pull this little blood out here and check it. So it just doesn't work. And so it's hard to be like, well, is this really the actual value? Now, the rationale that we then apply is what you can do, you can take venous blood. You can take like from a big vein, you can draw blood. So the blood that's going back to the heart. And that'll give you can then check what is the oxygen saturation of this pooled venous blood return. And if you measure that, whatever you would measure that value at, say 30%, your NIRS value in the muscle that's returning blood to that vein cannot be higher, because that would be weird. Right? And the argument would be if you're measuring a muscle, it is more likely has to be something lower. And the rationale is that this mixed venous blood is not just blood coming from muscles, which is what you're measuring. It's also coming from all the other tissue, for example, surface tissue like skin. But skin isn't metabolically active or not as metabolically active. So it'll have a higher percentage, which is mixing in, which is increasing the overall percent value of what you're measuring in the veins. So you create like a ceiling cap of like, okay, my device should measure below this value. And if it is, then it feels like it's probably doing something right. And so classically what NIRS did, which I think is the most robust way, is what you would do in an experimental setting is you would do an occlusion. So you'd pop your NIRS device in your arm, you would tie your arm off, and the signal, your oxygenation, and the signal would drop and it would drop and it would drop. And after 3, 4, 5, 6 minutes, it would plateau out. And now if you get this plateau, you would say, well, that's 0%. That's as low as I can go. If signals stop going anywhere, it might not be 0%. You don't know. I mean, you could do the venous blood, and venous blood is never 0%. So it's probably higher than 0%. But you can just calibrate it and say, well, this is my 0.
Yeah.
That's classically what's done. Now, this is really annoying to do. You have athletes and you got to occlude everyone's arm all the time, unless you're a big BFR component. Like, but the Moxy, to do a little bit of advertising here for our device, it does a pretty good job at that. If you occlude anyone's arm, everyone's going to get down to like, 8, 9, 10%. It'll bottom out there. No one's stopping at 35%. So this is how we create this reliability discussion.
Okay. So at least as long as it's, I mean, realistically, it's just like the body fat thing, right? It really doesn't matter what percent it says, as long as it's a consistent percent that we could base it off of. And then we base our, it's kind of like the analogy, right? You're just basing it off of that imaginary number, but as long as that imaginary number is proportionate consistently throughout, like that's kind of all that matters. Like the body fat, we don't even know how accurate our real body fat measurements are, right? So that, as long as it's reliable and consistent, that's what I care about. The accuracy isn't really the biggest thing for me. Now, how deep does it measure down, right? Do you say it measures down millimeter, centimeter, 2 centimeters? And if that's the case, going on a forearm, right? Like you're going to hit the radius in certain areas, you're going to hit the ulna. How do you prevent any kind of error from objects or any kind of artifacts? If someone has, let's say, some kind of contusion where calcium develops and there's not going to be as good a blood flow, how do you kind of work around that?
Mm-hmm. So the measurement depth is always half the distance of where you're like sending the infrared light in to where you're receiving it again. Now, if you make that infinitely big, you've got a problem of losing signal. But within a normal distance, so for the device I use, for example, you get about 15 millimeters, so 1.5 centimeters. Okay. Now, this is a problem with a population that isn't athletic.
Fat people, you mean?
So,
yeah,
you said it, not me. This is a problem. Now, there's different ways you can deal with this problem, but yeah, it's an issue. And so what happens if you get people with more than 50 millimeters, you're basically measuring more and more just fat, and then the signal gets really blunted. You just end up getting a flatter and flatter signal because you're getting less and less return from the muscle, which is definitely an issue. About you were saying about like other things like calcium deposits or like blood flow problems. Infrared. So first of all, you shouldn't use the devices have like muscle oxygen devices have a specific technique they apply, and different devices use them differently. But you should be careful which device you use to measure what. So you can use NIRS to measure brain blood volume changes as well. There's NIRS devices that do that. Now, but if you have, for example, the device that I use, it's not made for that. So it uses a very specific modeling technique, a Monte Carlo modeling technique, where it says, hey, we have skin, we have fat, and we have muscle. That's what's there. That's what our device is modeling. And if I'm getting any signal from all three of them, the device will be a good job measuring that. Now, if the depth is, if you have more fat than the 50 millimeters, your model falls apart because you only have two components of the model and you don't have the muscle component anymore. So it goes all kind of haywire because you're not getting any signal from the muscle. But if all of a sudden I put it on my head, I have, like you said, like, now I have bone matter in between, that's going to be a problem. If the bone matter comes after, that's not really an issue because it just kind of goes, again, the signal gets thrown out there anyways, because it's only bringing back this oxy or deoxy or hemoglobin, myoglobin. So that's not really such a big problem. It is an issue if you have someone who's like real wiry, right? And you put the device on somewhere where essentially there's no muscle, just like kind of on the front of the forearm or something, you're going to get a funky measure. You want to have the best is kind of some well-developed muscle with a certain amount of surface area that you can put the device on. But yeah, there's definitely limitations. Like sometimes, especially with we get some female athletes, like endurance type athletes, and they'll have like really skinny arms, and like the devices, you can almost not even really put it on their arm to get a surface area to get any kind of measurement from. So yeah, there's problems. There's definite limitations there.
Okay.
So Andri, mate, now, because it's so easy to collect the data and it's real time, have there been fluctuations in the daily oxygen, like local oxygen measurements? And if yes, could it ever be used as such a thing that, like HRV, people take their HRV each day? Would there be ever correlations with HRV if you measured, okay, my muscles better today than it was yesterday, for example?
Yeah, so I think I did a bad job commenting on that for the climbing study. But yeah, so we've done some studies with climbers But there's other studies, for example, long-term effect of eccentric work, where you do get this kind of long-term-ish change in these NIRS signals that return to normal after some period of time. So if we saw this with our climbers as well. I've seen this with cyclists, and there's studies that have shown this with heavy eccentric work, where, for example, your resting value for your muscle oxygenation is elevated after this kind of heavy training. And it'll stay elevated for a certain period of time, and then it comes back down. So there's maybe something here for like athlete readiness. If someone really tracks their resting muscle oxygen values, that they may be like, hey, this is abnormal. I'm always a little bit skeptical about resting values with muscle oxygenation, in that at rest, when the system's all down regulated, you have a really low cardiac output, you have a low blood flow, and you have low muscle oxygen consumption. So everything's like super low. And now you're measuring the signal, and small changes in this, so small upticks in heart rate or small changes in muscle activity, all of a sudden these really big effects on this signal, because remember, it's a percentage. It's always relative to what you're measuring in. So you need to then be careful that you can get really funky changes with very little impact. What I think it's more likely is that if you apply it in like your warm up, for example, when you get the system going and your cardiac output goes up, your muscle oxygen utilization goes up, so the whole thing gets revved up. And now small changes have less of an impact. So you're better at noticing, well, am I really different today than I was yesterday in this like revved up environment, if that makes sense. So that's what I tend to tell people.
Makes complete sense. I mean, we never make decisions on what we're doing for the day until after we're warmed up. So makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And what you had said to that, Brooker, too, with the HRV, and obviously and I shouldn't say obviously, but if your heart rhythm isn't consistent, it's going to have the impact on the amount of work that it has to do. And the amount of work that it has to do, it's going to increase the resting heart rate, or it's going to increase or drop your max heart rate and increase your ability to buffer out the hydrogen or produce or not produce lactic acid, right? And that's essentially what this is measuring. So when do you have anything with this product that does HRV? Or any kind of heart rate regulation? Like this seems like an all-in-one, because if you could do all that, you could measure it like this, a one-stop shop all at once. You could do readiness instantly.
Yeah. So like the Garmin watches and that do the pulse measurements on there you go. Yeah, those HRV. So the technology there is very similar. It also, right? So we're doing a similar thing, and you can measure heart rate with the Moxy. It works. The problem is, the advantage of measuring it on your wrist here is you don't really have that much active muscle that's going to mess up your signal. Whereas as soon as you start doing, like at rest, it works really well. And as soon as you start doing any kind of activity, it goes haywire, because the muscles working, those contractions are working, and it doesn't measure accurately anymore. What it does in that case do, though, is you can track your cycling cadence on it. Because every time you're going around, the muscle contracts and does this. You can measure how quick you have enough resolution. Yeah, that works. So to the point is, yes, theoretically you could. We don't do it because of the error potentials. We just don't feel that it's not robust enough to do it. And there's other tools that do it really well. Mm-hmm.
So why even dive into it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's just so tangent. I mean, there have been other NIRS. So the Moxy was the first, this kind of consumer-oriented NIRS device, the first one in the market. And we're fairly conservative with what we say, or we try to be. And there have been other devices that have come online, and what they have promised, what they're going to be able to do, and which is like, well sit together. Like with Roger, he's like the engineer, he's the brain behind everything. He's like, man, if they can do that, they're just better. Because he's like, I've been trying to do this for a long time. It doesn't work. You can't get it to do that. And it always turns out that they can't get it to do that, right? So things just aren't always possible.
How long does a battery last on it?
Yeah, so the new devices are 6 hours plus. And that's just like what the manufacturer of the battery gives, like 6 hours plus. You can then change some sampling rate stuff to make it more or less. And of course, after a couple of years of charging cycles, it drops off.
Do you have the ability to do EMG as well?
No, we don't do EMG. So I mean, at the university, I have an EMG tool, but the device doesn't do EMG. I think that's a super interesting combination that should get worked on, like an all-in-one EMG. Yeah. And the signal response is pretty similar. It's like a lot of overlap what's going on, right? When you have EMG activity, you get a change in muscle oxygenation. Like these things are very tightly knit together, especially this idea of like systemic fatigue, local fatigue, combining EMG and the muscle oxygenation. I think there's lots of potential. I don't do as much EMG work as I would like. So I've done some, but I by no means think that I'm kind of EMG expert. So, but I think you're onto something. If you NIRS EMG combination, you're there. Yeah.
So if the battery life is 6 hours, right? How long does it take to charge a thing?
I should know all these things. I always forget all these the technical specifications. I was like, I keep reading them and I forget them. It doesn't take very long. It's like an hour. It's like the new ones are like wireless, like induction chargers. You like pop them on this whole thing. It takes like an hour.
I mean, there's no reason to believe that you can't get a full-on, you can't come up with your own algorithm for a full-on readiness score, because if it's the muscle contraction that gets in the way of the measurement of the heart rate, right? To put this on someone's thigh or on their arm while they're asleep. And you could take that data and now you can make this an all-in-one. So now you measure how long their fatigue takes while they're exercising, and you combine that with the sleep score, and eventually you get enough data. All of a sudden you have the most accurate measurement of HRV and readiness that anyone can have. And you actually also have it because who else is doing the combining this with blood oxygen levels? Maybe we should do this off the damn podcast. Holy shit.
There we go. And it's not, but what's cool is that you're looking at it from a global point as well as the local point. So you're looking at it the whole way through. Yeah. I
don't see why you can't do this now. The algorithm, the data collection is the hardest part, probably.
Yeah. So I'm definitely, I'm there. I think that there's lots of potential there. I'm always a skeptic at heart. I try to not, but yeah, I think that there's potential there. I'm always worried the error. I'm always more of a it's not going to work, then it's going to work kind of guy.
Yeah. But that's what makes a good product. That's what makes a good tester. So I'm with you on that. I always question it. So you're on the right track, I think.
So Andri, I mean, we mentioned it already, and it's funny because I forgot all about it. Now, that live O2 bag that Mike was talking about.
Yeah.
Mike was speaking a lot about this and this technology and stuff like that. And the claims look really good. And I reached out to you and asked you about it. And that skeptic mind of yours was like, yeah, I'm not quite sure and all of that. Could you go into a little bit of the physiology behind what it is and why, like, what it claims might not be completely true and what it could offer?
So just to make sure that we are talking about the right thing. So it's like a hypoxia, like an intermittent hypoxia device, right?
Yeah.
But I think you can also do hyper-oxygenation.
There's two sections. There's like 90% oxygen and there's like 65% oxygen.
Yeah.
And then you train in the 65% until you get to like below 80% blood oxygen levels. Then you switch on to the 90 and super saturate it until it reaches 100. And then you're done. So what I've been told is that the hypoxic into like the super saturation is supposed to be glorious. You know what I mean? It's having all these benefits, and just by pumping it, you know, instantly with all this pure oxygen and all, they're saying that there's a lot of benefits that are occurring. And I think even including, I could be way off on this, but increasing mitochondrial density as well by the deprivation with the saturation. So go have at it. Let me know.
Go wild on that. So I think hypoxia and hyperoxia and the combination of two have potential benefits. And I think there's pretty good data on both of those that they can be. I'm always skeptical. What I'm skeptical of is this like broadband of like, you just do it on everyone, it's going to work with everyone. Just generally there's a lot of non-responders, or let's say not as positive responders or even negative responders to a lot of these different, and you get that. So you read these research and all this, you know, hypoxia, it works, and it'll always give you some means, right? It'll be like before control group and like the before and after groups and stuff. And it looks great because they all have these significant results. And then you actually go talk to people and you try to find the data and you realize, yeah, but of your, 20 participants, 5 of them didn't have any response, but 10 of them had huge response. So you get this like nice mean that you can calculate it out on. That happens a lot. One of my pet peeves is if you have less than 30 participants in a study, you should really try to at least show the response of everyone, so you can see how many of them didn't actually follow the response that you're saying would happen. So that's a side note. Now, this goes a little bit into, I'll talk about the hypoxia part, into this supply and demand component. So the classic way of hypoxic training was altitude training. You would go to altitude, and that showed some pretty good results. You get some people get pretty good altitude results with, and some people had none. And so you get these really mixed data sets with altitude training and with intermittent hypoxic training as well. And so you get this clear non-responder group. And in my opinion, the reason for this is exactly the point that if your performance, let's say your aerobic performance is based on oxygen supply and demand, but you can be limited by either or, to keep it simple, demand or supply. And hypoxia as a stimulus at the demand level, at the local oxygen level. But if you already are really good at using oxygen and you do a hypoxic response, you're gonna have trouble making more gains there. You need to actually supply more oxygen. So sorry, I made a mistake there. The hypoxia has a systemic effect. So you create more red blood cells. So you're bringing more oxygen in. But if you don't need any of that more oxygen, you're not going to have this huge benefit. And I do find that endurance athletes, like good endurance athletes, have a better response to hypoxic training than like amateur ones.
Well, yeah, they're trained in deprivation. Right. So they're just used to it. It's that makes sense.
That they're also the ones that have a better impact on like hypo. So if you dope up pros, they have a much better response than if you dope up amateurs. Because basically if you give hypo, you generate this super boosted oxygen supply system. But if oxygen supply was never your problem, because you've got tons of oxygen, it's not going to help you as much, right? You should really, and I think that's one of the problems with hypoxic training. And hyperoxia training is like the other side. The advantage of hyperoxia training is if someone has this huge problem of getting enough oxygen, so it's hard to really then train the local muscle because it's always undersaturated, like you're not bringing enough oxygen in. It's going to help there, right? Because you're gonna super boost this more oxygen. The problem is a little bit, are you just going to keep advancing this local stimulus, and then in the race you don't get it, and you may just run into more of a deficit problem. But the data is pretty good that it works. I'm not too worried about that. One of the more interesting things is that what is often an issue is less, it's less of a how much oxygen, how much oxygen am I supplying, but it's like it's a blood pressure issue. So often what happens is that if you have this athlete and he has these crazy legs, this crazy capillarization, and he starts working really hard and he's opening all these blood vessels, he actually has to down regulate his performance because his blood pressure will drop, right? And so there's some work by Holmberg with cross-country skiers where they do upper body and they do lower body and then they do upper and lower body. And the work capacity, upper body, lower body added together is always way more than upper and lower body. Because essentially, if you just do upper body, the upper body can open up more because it doesn't also have to feed the lower body. And if you just do the lower body, it can open up more because your arms aren't doing anything. But if you do them both, you have to find a balance. And one of the problems is that you just don't have enough blood. I mean, you have a certain amount of blood in your system. And if you then are opening up all these blood vessels, all these pathways, your blood pressure would drop. And your body doesn't let that. So it actually starts reducing blood flow to a lot of these areas to maintain blood pressure. And that then reduces performance. So just juicing up your blood with oxygen if you don't have that much blood is a problem. That's why for a lot of athletes, giving plasma expanders is already helpful. Like you don't have to give any more red blood cells. You just have to make their blood volume higher. And that's helpful because it stabilizes blood pressure.
So one of the things that these oxygen people, right? And it's not just the one company. There's a lot of like, everyone's a zealot with shit. I guess they're like oxygen zealots with this. Like they're saying that by getting enough oxygen now, it's going to improve your sleep. It's going to, by doing things like this, it'll improve sleep. It'll improve recovery. How is the deprivation coupled with the saturation, hypo plus hyper, that combination, how could that possibly be, I don't know, more beneficial than just going on a run, becoming hypoxic, than taking your time, slowing down, breathing, and getting back to 100% oxygen level? Like why does the 90% oxygen matter? Does it matter, in your opinion?
So one of the things that does happen is that like a lot of like your metabolic pathways to how you're generating energy is related to oxygen availability. So like you just said, if you do some hyperoxia, what happens, for example, with lactate, which is a very simple measurement tool to assess metabolism, is basically your glucose glycogen metabolism is shown in lactate production, the balance of it. And so what happens is if you give someone hyperoxia, the whole curve of this lactate accumulation is blunted and it's pushed out. It all happens later. So this whole imbalance of glycolysis and glycogenolysis is balanced out by having more oxygen available. This is the argument that it says that it enhances. So you get this increased PGC expression, which is like a precursor to mitochondrial biogenesis. That essentially, because you're allowing the oxidative pathways to work more effectively because you're never limiting oxygen availability, you're getting a better training stimulus there. That's the hyperoxia argument.
But like you said, if your body can't get the oxygen when the competition is there, it downregulates the system anyway.
Yeah, I mean, that's going to, that's what happens if you've never done this, but you go to altitude there, everything gets downregulated, right? Well, whatever the term you want to use, yeah, your performance goes to crap. And this is, but again, there is data that says that there's some transfer to that.
Okay.
So I've read literature on this. I don't do hyperoxia. I've done hyperoxia lab work where I play around with oxygen levels for my NIRS research, but I haven't done any research on hyperoxia training effects. I'm just spitting back what I've read on that, right? I'm always skeptical of doing things that are way different. I think your training should reflect your event, right? That's also like if you know my world championships are going to be in Rio de Janeiro and it's going to be 40 degrees and humid as fuck. Are we allowed to swear on here?
Oh,
assuming we're allowed to.
Fuck yeah.
Okay. I'm a dad now. I got to be careful, right? So yeah. So and it's humid as fuck, and so when you're doing all your training at like 20 degrees, perfect, you know, it's like that just doesn't make any sense. And so, for example, I talk a bunch with the trainers of the Norwegian triathlon team. They're top right now, and they do a lot of that. They do a lot of actually Moxy training work as well, and they use the Moxy to basically be like, hey, so we're in Norway now, and now we're flying, and we're going to Brazil. Now we know what your Moxy response is in Norway during your training. What happens now that you're in Brazil and you just got jet lagged and it's 40 degrees out and it's humid, and you see the change in the signal. I'm like, okay, now we need to change, you know, don't keep riding your 300 watts because your 300 watts in Brazil are 400 watts. Like it's not gonna be the same. And then they adjust, for that. And I'm way off on a tangent there, but does that all follow somehow? Yes, that makes sense.
You're all right.
For sure, bro.
So here's something that I've noticed with it, and you let me know your thoughts. When I'm training on it and I go into hyper-oxygen, my heart rate can go through the roof and I don't get fatigued. Why? Because I'm able to filter out all the shit because I'm funneling tons of oxygen there. It makes sense. How does that impact now training at that high level, like for my heart rate to be at that high of a level for a significant period of time while still having the saturation, would that transfer to local improvement? Would that be the localized endurance? Is that a good way to do it? Or would it be negative because I'm still not getting the hypoxic training? Did I phrase that properly?
I'm not sure what you're trying to say, but this is exactly the point. I think you do the hyperoxic training, you're going to get, I think you can get a supercharged local response because basically you are like assisting your supply system, right?
You're putting a battery pack on.
Yeah, right. So like you said, your heart rate per watt level actually comes down, but you can perform more higher, right? So before, if you do hyperoxia at 200 watts, you would have had 150 heart rate. Now you have 140 because it's just easier. Mm-hmm. Everything's easier. So you can supercharge. You can do all the supermax work, right? That's always been the question: is if that's useful or not. Now, generally, I think there is some consensus that there is, but it's not so clear because not everyone's doing it. I mean, it's not hard to supplement oxygen. This isn't it's that difficult. But not everyone's doing it for some reason. I mean, and it's been around for a while. I mean,
yeah,
I know super eyes. This isn't something new. It kind of cycles in and out again. I think there is a there, and I think the main thing is to figure out when, how, and how to dose it. And it's like BFR. Like I think BFR is probably very useful, but it kind of has the same problem that you supercharge you have the supercharged local effect on your muscle, and then how useful is that in the long term? Which is like there's in Switzerland that there's some groups that do a lot of kind of occlusion blood flow restriction training, and they're really big on it. Like this is the mother of all training systems. And they did a lot with the Swiss national ski team, and one summer they did, I think, like, yeah, we were talking about this, Alex. I think they did like the whole summer they did this occlusion training, just like wing gaits and tying off your leg, and they had like tons of injury results after. Like, and it's just like, yeah, well, it's, you know, you're getting like all this metabolite accumulation in your legs. You're not letting it go anywhere, and you're repeating this over and over. Okay, high stimulus, but I mean, you have other structures in your leg as well that just, yeah, and yeah, it's
But we see it a lot, right? Like in research, I mean, you mentioned the difference between college students and elite athletes, but there's also a huge difference between what you do in a lab over 4 weeks and an athlete has 3 years away that they're still trying to work towards, and they've got all this history of injuries and problems, and they're away from their sport doing something else. So how much does it really transfer over to? So it's all really, really hard. When I was at university in Loughborough, I remember in exercise physiology, the professor mentioning that lactate doesn't make you get tired. And that was the first time that I heard of it. And this was all those years back. Now, I still hear people saying that people get tired because of lactate. I don't know if there's a consensus out now, or maybe it's a pretty hard question, but why do we get tired?
Oh man, why do we get tired? I don't know. I don't think there's a consensus. So one of the most popular theories for a long time is kind of an acidosis proton accumulation theory, which is long tied to lactate. It isn't anymore. But that's still like the acidosis thing is still the problem is there's a lot of data and experiments that show like highly acidic environments with super contracting muscle fibers. So there's some contradiction there. Inorganic phosphate accumulation is also often considered. There's like potassium depletion. There's a lot of different ideas out there. And all of these are very like muscle local, like what's stopping the local muscle from contracting. And these are all kind of in this peripheral fatigue model. Like you get your peripheral muscles are getting tired and they can't contract anymore. Then there's also like these central fatigue models. Mm-hmm. So the central governor is one of these models from Timothy Noakes, and there's lots of debate back and forth between these different groups. And the central governor model is more along the lines of your central nervous system has a governor, and he tells you when you can no longer perform your exercise because you will endanger your system. And I mean, this, when the central governor tells you to do this, is obviously then linked to things like proton accumulation, or I mean, these are intertwined, right? It's just kind of like a top-down or let's say a federal or a stateside approach, right? So if it's top-down or it's bottom-up. I tend to agree with the central governor approach. I think that makes more sense of evolutionary perspective, that you have defense mechanisms, and that you have a central governor that's basically a central system that's telling you to stop or not. There's a bunch of other research out, for example, that your respiratory muscles can get fatigued, and when they get fatigued, you actually reduce blood flow to the working muscle, so in cycling to your legs. This makes sense in the context of a central governor. And the central governor basically says, if your respiratory muscles get fatigued and they no longer can maintain work of breathing, you're dead. So I need to make sure you stop exercising. So I'm going to do that by basically turning your legs off. So I would stop blood flow to your legs. Then you have to reduce performance, and I protect my respiratory muscles. This is also one of the ideas of respiratory training, right? To make your respiratory muscles more efficient, so this reflex doesn't kick in as quickly. This metabow reflex. It's Dempsey and colleagues in the US were one of the first to identify this as a factor, which is interesting in training, right? That your respiratory muscles can limit performance. But then Noakes talks about the same thing being there with just your cardiac system. So if it was a peripheral fatigue problem, if your periphery stopped performance, you would always be able to just maximize your cardiac output. Your heart rate will always go as hard as it can until your muscles give out. But when you go to altitude, your whole heart performance decreases. It's like, why would your heart performance decrease at altitude? Why? You know it can do more at sea level. Why is it going down at altitude? Well, because the heart itself starts having problems. So it needs to slow down, because otherwise, if the heart stops beating, you're dead. Whereas anything happens with your muscles, you're not dead. I mean, maybe you're not walking, so the tiger will get you at some point in time, but you have a couple minutes more. Does that help a little bit?
It does. And I think The reason why I wanted to ask is because I think a lot of it is based on what is the demand that's in front of you too, because some people have these feats where they're able to do things that under normal circumstances they might not be able to. Now, if we look at the central governor theory, based on a disaster situation or life and death or huge emotional stress, we're able to sort of get a little bit extra out. Of course, we can't sort of break the rules of physics, but that kind of makes a lot more sense. I just wasn't sure what the latest research was, and I knew that it'd be a nice question to ask you anyway. One of the things, I know we don't have too long left, one of the things that I enjoyed when we first started meeting too, I remember you got me jumping with a pulse oximeter on, jumping, then making me hyperventilate, and then making me breathe into a spiral tiger, and then jumping to try to make me puke. And you were a huge guy in training respiratory muscles with the spiral tiger and different things like this. And now breathing exercises and respiratory training is huge. Can you go a little bit into what you found, what you find interesting in this field?
Yeah. So, I mean, the rationale behind the respiratory muscle training or the pulmonary muscle training was just explained, right? The idea is that unlike what was classically told, I was taught this in my first year of exercise phys as well, respiratory muscles are never limiting performance. You breathe all day, you're totally fine. And one of the awesome reasonings behind this was, well, if you do a maximum minute ventilation test, so like how fast can I breathe in 1 minute, you can never do that because you hyperventilate. So you really just do 15 seconds, you times it by 4, and then you get a maximum minute, which is already dumb because if you could actually do it per minute, it probably wouldn't be as high as your 15-second max times 4. I mean, this is like, if I run 100 meters in 12 seconds, then I'm going to run my 400 meters in 48 seconds, obviously. That's not how it works. But the idea was so that this minute would give you, well, what is your breathing performance? And if you then do your cycling endurance test and you finish your ramp and you say, I'm done, I can't go any harder, you can compare your max minute ventilation and say, well, but you can breathe way more. Like, look at this, you can breathe way higher. So obviously you were never limited there. It's kind of like a marathon runner telling, well, you could run way faster. Like, obviously speed is not your problem. It makes no sense. I hope that rationale behind that is kind of blown out of the water. The idea being that your respiratory muscles can limit performance. There's pretty good data on this. What is less conclusive is, well, can we do something about it specifically? So can I specifically train my respiratory muscles to do more work and more work efficiently? This data isn't as conclusive as we would like to be. There's lots of studies that show that. There's some contradictory work. I know a lot of pulmonary experts are like, yeah, this doesn't work. My argument is the respiratory muscles, the diaphragm, your intercostal muscles, they're skeletal muscle. There is absolutely no reason, in my opinion, as to why you wouldn't be able to train them just like you would train any other muscle. It makes no sense. You should be able to train them. And in my experience, you can train them. You can get results by doing respiratory training where people increase their performance by just doing like breathing exercises. There's lots of different ways you can obviously do this. One of the reasons that I think there's controversy around it, again, is that you have this high degree of responders and non-responders. And this again goes back to the situation that if you give someone whose respiratory muscles are not limiting their performance respiratory training to do, they're probably just not going to improve that much. And that's kind of what we saw. And that's what we did when we did the statistical alliance testing. We tried to generate a responder, non-responder group by saying, well, if you need more, if you're oxygen limited, if you need more then maybe your respiratory training will be effective for you. Whereas if it looks like, well, it looks like you've got tons of oxygen in your muscles, we're going to assume respiratory training is less likely to be effective for you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Spot on.
Right on.
You have anything else, Mike?
No, I do, but it'll take too long for me to get to my point on it. So let's cut it there. Bro, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast. Where can everyone find you? What are your products? What's your website? What's your handle? Give us all the information.
Yeah, I'm super enough prep for this. So my name's Andri Feldmann, and I have a YouTube channel.
No
it's
shit.
pretty,
You have a YouTube channel?
yeah, it's pretty amateur, but I just answer questions that people send me about NIRS. It's called NIRS Sports Science. You'll like my little logo. I did it up in about 5 minutes. It's pretty dope. Yeah, so people can check me out there and ask me questions. And I always try to answer them. I have like, I don't know, 50 questions backlogged that I still have to answer. But please send me, and if you send a better question, I will answer yours first. That's how I do it. So it's not first come, first serve. It's better questions get answered first. So there, yeah, you can check out my YouTube channels. If for every 100 followers more I get, my wife buys me dinner. So I've gotten 2 dinners, so I think at like 201 followers or something like that. I don't know if they actually follow me, but at least they clicked the button.
What's your YouTube? What's your YouTube handle?
It's called Near Sportsy, man. Handled, man. It's called Near Sports Science. Near Sport. I'm gonna put it into my PC right now and see what comes up.
Oh yeah, I got it here. 203
yeah.
subscribers. Oh yeah, that's a fancy logo, mate. Mike, I'll send it to you. Hang on.
Okay.
Yeah. So you can get people on there, so I get free dinners. Yeah, you can check that out. I try to answer some questions about stuff, and some of the stuff we've talked about here is kind of been answered on there. I go on rants. So that, and then the company I work for is, first of all, Idiag AG. It's in Switzerland. They make this respiratory training device. So please feel free. Respiratory training. It's a very cool respiratory training device. I would recommend it. Brooker's used it before too. And the last is, of course, Moxy Monitor, which I'm the co-developer of the NIRS device we talked about that I use. Go check that out. Yeah, we think it's pretty cool. Definitely, we see potential there.
Perfect.
Cool. Thank you, Andri, man. Really,
right.
Thanks for spending the time, buddy.
Thank you.
I hope this is useful for you guys.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hope we get you some kind of following from this. More than 203 subscribers, but maybe not. Who knows?
There you go. That's okay. All right.
Cool,
Thanks,
buddy.
brother.
Thanks, bud. Have a good one.
Thanks.